Hi, I'm Dr. Rod, and with many years' experience restoring and renovating bikes under my belt, the people at Men & Motors thought they could bring my services to you, the viewer. So welcome to my workshop. This week my biker in need of a little helping hand is Ian Smart from Livingston in Scotland, who has brought his 1968 BSA Starfire down, which has seen rather better days. Now this of course is a British classic, so it's a little bit different to the Japanese 4s that I usually work on for bread and butter. And if we can get the thing to start at the end of his visit, Ian will be very happy. Well, welcome to the workshop, Ian.
It's a pleasure to be here, Rod.
And I guess you've had a little bit of trouble with this bike.
Yeah, it's really difficult for me to start it. It will start, but I don't know whether there's something that's wrong with the bike or whether it's just my technique, 'cause it's the first British bike that I've actually owned.
Do you mind if I ever got starting it up myself?
By all means.
Let's see what she does. So, ignition switch is down here. Right, so we turn the ignition on. There's a fuel tap on this side as well. And am I right in thinking you have to prime the carburettor on this one?
Yes, you do, yeah.
Okay, so if we give that a little bit of a tickle there. Although this is the old British jargon, tickle its carburettor. Right, let's give it a kick and see what happens. No, that doesn't want to go, does it?
See what I mean? It is difficult to get going.
Yeah. To be frank, look at that. I don't know if you can tell what's happening there, but the Kickstarter isn't turning the engine over every time I kick it. That's actually getting a wee bit soggy. I suspect that what may be happening is the clutch might be slipping slightly. So what I'd like to do before we get too involved in the engine, let's just have a quick look at the clutch and see if we can adjust that and then make sure it's kicking over properly every time. Okay? Let's get the bike up on the bench and then we can actually see what we're working with.
Okay.
BSA stands for Birmingham Small Arms and started life in 1854 as an association of gunsmiths formed to supply arms to the Crimean War. It started making bikes at the turn of the century and became for a while the world's largest manufacturer of motorbikes. In the 1960s, some of BSA's finest models were produced before its eventual decline and bankruptcy as it steadfastly refused to acknowledge the threat from Japanese bikes. Ian's BSA is brought for me to look at today is from 1968 and is a road bike called the Starfire. The Starfire represents the last of the line of an iconic number of British BSA singles, which became key bikes in the 1960s. So here's a bike up on the bench. Now let's have a look at this clutch adjustment and see what we can do. Well, Ian, to adjust your clutch, there's a little inspection cap here if you have a look at this one. What I'm going to do is just whip that cap off there and there should be an adjuster screw inside it.
Okay.
Hopefully that's all it'll need, but here's where we find out. With that cap out of the way, inside there, can you see that?
Yeah.
There's an adjuster screw there and a lock nut on it. Now that's actually the end of the clutch push rod. I've put some slack in the clutch cable, so that's nice and loose. Got to do that first. And the next thing I'm going to do now is just slacken that lock nut off there. There we go. From right, that socket should just about fit that. Of course, this bike is British, so all the sizes are imperial. But right, I've now slackened that lock nut off. Now, if you have a look at that adjuster, to be set correctly, I wind it in so it touches the end of the push rod and then back it off about 1/4 of a turn and it should lock up there. Now then, the bad news is that was actually set okay. So that's not the problem, unfortunately. I think what we're going to have to do then, in order to examine this fault a bit more detail, is take this cover off.
Okay.
And let's actually have a look at the clutch in there. Are you up for having a go at that?
Yeah. We'll have a go at this. We'll have a go at this.
This is where your adventure with your British bike really starts.
What it's all about.
Okay. It shouldn't be too difficult a job. In order to get this cover off and have a look at the gubbins underneath, we're first of all going to have to get this stuff out of the way. This is a rear brake pedal, which I'm hoping will pivot down far enough to be out of the way of where we're working. Of course it won't at the moment, but there's an adjuster screw there. So if I wind this adjuster screw back, what I'm actually doing is putting lots of slack in the rear brake adjustment. So that should allow us to push the brake pedal down. You see, I'm getting more slack in that as we go. Now while I'm doing that, if you can have a go at taking this footrest off, it's all done with a single bolt there, and strange as it may seem, I think you'll find an 18mm spanner will fit, although it may not be what BSA originally specified. Anyway, shall we have a crack at this?
Okay.
That's most of the oil out. I've left the drain tray there just so it catches any little residual bits that come out.
Okay.
Now to get this cover off, we've got all these screws around the edge of it. These are crosshead screws. They should, if we're lucky, just undo like that. Have a go and see what you find. We sometimes find that these are quite tight though and they may need just a little bit of persuasion.
Oh, that one's come straight out.
Good, right. Before you take each one out, just work around and loosen them all off. And it isn't really necessary on a bike, on a casting this small, but it's good workshop procedure to kind of work diagonally rather than go around.
Alright,
So what I'll do, now you've got these two loose, try loosening these two down here. And if you just work in a nice diagonal sequence, it means the cover comes loose evenly. And hopefully it'll stop it ever leaking oil, which of course British bikes never do. Now what have we done so far? Well, the first thing we've done is take this outer cover off so we can actually get to the clutch and gubbins underneath. And the first tip that I've given Ian is to take the screws off diagonally. That stops the cover from distorting and stops any possibility of oil leaks when it all goes back together. And of course we've already found some rather strange screw sizes and left-handed threads, and you must be prepared to come across this kind of thing when you are working on old British classic bikes. Right, well, have we got all the screws out of that, yeah?
Yep, that's them all.
Super, and the cover's actually come loose, it's playing ball, sometimes you still can't. So if I hold that down, hopefully you can just waggle the cover loose and just pop it safely out of the way.
There you go. What is everything there?
Okay, this might look a bit complicated on the face of it, but it's fairly simple stuff once you get used to what there is flying around inside British bikes. Okay. First of all, this bit here is your alternator. This bit spins around when the engine's running and it makes electrical power, and that charges the battery and keeps the lights running, etc, etc. And the first thing I've noticed here, I've got to say, can you see the state of that nut?
That has been chewed somewhat, hasn't it?
Somebody's been bashing that around with a chisel, which I'm afraid isn't very encouraging if that's the kind of maintenance it's had. However, nothing else looks too desperately bodged at this stage. But what you've got here then, this device here is actually the clutch. This is the bit that connects the gearbox to the rest of the engine. And the clutch connects to the engine by this chain here, and that's called the primary chain, because they used to call this one a secondary chain at the back, so you'd have a primary chain and a secondary chain. Now the primary chain does wear slack while the engine's running, so there's a tensioner to keep it adjusted, which is there.
That's there.
If you ever need to adjust your chain tension, you do it as part of a service, but that's actually fine like that. The problem we've got at the moment is this clutch, which is slipping. On a British bike, when you operate the Kickstarter, it drives the engine through the clutch. Now, Japanese bikes work slightly differently. Right. But the problem is here, when we're putting full load on the Kickstarter, that's slipping around. Now, I'm hoping that we won't have to strip the clutch right down to fix it, but we can adjust it. That's the adjuster that I had a go at there to get the operating mechanism working properly, but it still didn't do the job. So what I want to do now is try tightening these 4 screws slightly. Okay. Each one of those has a spring underneath it, and those are the springs that hold the clutch together. Now, in order to do that, you can use just a great big monster screwdriver. But I have here, this is actually, believe it or not, the genuine BSA service tool for the job.
A genuine antique.
It certainly is, yes, I've had that for years. And you will notice as well that it's been rather subtly modified by having a big bolt welded onto it, which gives you a little bit more purchase. If you try hooking that into there, and what I'm going to suggest is just give each one of those 4 screws a single turn. Okay. If you turn that inwards, just be careful you don't scratch your side panel as you go around. And you're actually turning against spring pressure, so there will feel to be a bit of resistance. And all you're doing there is adding a little bit more spring tension to the clutch. So that should make the clutch a bit tighter, and hopefully it means that we'll be able to kickstart the engine properly. After the cover came off, we first of all had a look at the alternator, and there's obvious signs of bodgerate on the main nut that holds it all together. We had a quick look at the primary chain, and that's actually in fine condition. And finally, I asked Ian to adjust the clutch spring nuts, which will increase tension on the clutch and hopefully will stop it slipping. How did you come to own this bike? Because it's quite a change to the other bikes that you've had in the past, isn't it?
It certainly is a change. I actually bought it over the internet. I did everything that I would advise anybody else not to do. Right. It was a moment of madness. I just decided I want a little bit of a project. I saw this bike on the internet. I thought I'm gonna have that bike.
Right, you saw a little grainy JPEG on a computer screen?
Yeah, that's basically what it was. Right. I mean, the bike itself was based down in South Wales, and I'm up in Scotland, so it wasn't really practical to actually go and see the bike.
Several hundred miles you've had to travel to buy the bike, though.
Oh, I didn't actually do the travelling myself. I actually got it transported up to me after I'd actually paid for it.
So you didn't even see the bike until it was delivered to your door?
Not until it was delivered to my door.
Wow, that's quite a lot of confidence you had in buying it.
Yeah, as I say, it was something that I would advise anybody else not to do. Right. Okay, I think I've been lucky with this one. I got in touch with a chap that was actually selling it through email, got copies of documents sent through, everything looked fine. So I sent off the cheque and the bike arrived. Yeah,
so you took some sensible precautions as much as you could.
As much as I could, yes.
Yeah. Anyway, shall we go back and have a crack at this BSA and see if we can get a bit further with it?
Yeah, I think we need to.
Okay, ready for round 2?
Yep.
Right, we've managed to put Ian's bike back together, so now for the moment of truth. Is it going to start? Ian, do you want to have a go at firing her up?
Yeah, we'll have a
See what
go.
happens. I've got both my fingers crossed. Whoa, you got the ignition on?
Oh, that does help.
Signs of life.
Nearly.
It's a bit of a technique this after Japanese, like. Whoa.
Do you want to give it a go? I haven't got the technique.
Right. Well, swap positions. Do you want to come round this side?
Okay.
And do a little dance around it. Let's see if she'll behave for me. There we go.
Right, it's going.
That actually sounds quite healthy. I'm quite pleased with that. But she's not going to keep running. Alright, you've put a new carburettor on here, haven't you, Ian?
Yes, that's right.
Sounds like we're going to have to do a little bit of tinkering on that to get it to run properly. So come back in part 2 and we'll have a go at setting the carburettor up. Welcome to part 2. This week Ian has brought his 1968 BSA Starfit down to my workshop for a little bit of fettling. We've already had a look at the clutch, which was giving some problems, but now his bike is actually starting. It still isn't running properly. Ian, you've already put a new carburettor on this bike, I believe.
Yes, that's right. This is the old one that I actually took off. I took it off because the first time I started the bike, it was started on full throttle and just wouldn't idle at all. I had to switch it off quickly to stop it bouncing down the drive.
That sounds quite dramatic. Okay. So you've actually put a brand new carb already on the bike.
That's
This
right.
is the old one.
That's right.
Right. So one or two things that we might have to adjust on there. First of all, the way the carburettor works, when you twist the throttle, what it actually does is opens that throttle slide, and that moves up and down like that inside the carburettor body. And that's what controls how the engine actually revs. Now on this one, if I push it up to the top, it actually sticks at the top. There, it goes to the top, and it won't go any further. It actually jams in place, and that was what obviously was causing your over revving problem. Now we've sorted that out with a new carburettor, but it still isn't idling properly. There's two different adjustments that you can make on this with those two screws there. One of them, that actually controls the mixture of air to petrol as it's going into the engine. That second screw there controls the idle speed.
Right.
And what we need to do now is, with the bike running, is play around with the adjustments on those two screws until it runs evenly, which hopefully we'll be able to do. So if I can pass that to you, I'll have a go at firing the bike up, and we need to do with this with the engine running. So hopefully she'll start again for us. Right, what I'm going to do now, Ian, can you just hold the throttle so it doesn't stall? What I'm going to do is turn one of those screws up, which will give us an idle. So we'll put the screwdriver on there. Right, you can let go of that now. There we go, and the bike's now running on its own carburettor setting. That sounds a bit better.
It does.
Now what I'm going to do, I've turned the idle screw up so the bike's ticking over. I'm now going to set the mixture on this screw here. If I turn the screw one way or the other, the engine will run happier and faster. Just give it a blip. Sounds pretty good.
That sounds much better.
That sounds lovely to me. Do you want to take her out for a bit of a test ride, Ian, and see what
I think it's about time.
Yeah. Okay, smash it. Let's find your crash helmet.
Okay.
It's quite important now for Ian to be test riding the bike, because while we've made some adjustments to it, we don't yet know if there are any other faults with the machine. Obviously the bike's now running, but it will need some test mileage put on it to make sure that everything is right, particularly things like carburettor settings and the ignition timing. After a shakedown ride like this, there will be one or two adjustments that need making to bed in. This bike hasn't done a lot of mileage over the past few years, and this is something of a maiden flight. It'll be important to make sure that the valve clearances are okay and that the spark plug's firing properly. If you're used to riding a modern bike, then riding a classic is going to be quite a different experience. These bikes require quite a lot of input, not only in the riding, but also the maintenance and the way that you have to look after them. How are you doing, Ian? How was it?
That was fantastic, Rod. Absolutely fantastic.
Excellent. Is it running better than it was before?
Much better, much better.
What's she like to ride?
Oh, she's great. She's great. I couldn't have asked for more from her. I was giving her age. I mean, the handling compared to a modern bike, I was really surprised how quickly it actually turns into the corners.
Right. There might be 1 or 2 tweaks we can still do to make the bike run just as good as she possibly can do.
Yeah.
So what I'd like to do is get her back into the workshop now, and let's just see if we can add a few minor tuning details just to make things even better. Is that okay?
Yeah, that'd be brilliant.
Let's get her into the workshop then.
Okay.
Now Ian's bike is now running pretty well, but there's still 1 or 2 health checks I'd like to do before I pronounce it fully fit. First thing I'd like to do is have a look at the points and the ignition timing on your bike. And in order to do that, the first thing to do is to take this cover off here. First thing I do notice is a little trace of oil in the bottom there. Now there is actually an oil seal in the back of this casing that runs on the end of this shaft here. So at some point it might be worth taking that cover off and fitting a new oil seal just to stop that. It's not a major problem at the moment, so I wouldn't lose too much sleep over it, but it's well to notice that it's there. Now what you've got over here, these are the contact breaker points, and this is actually a mechanical switch that controls when the spark plug fires. If you're used to modern Japanese bikes, of course, you don't have contact breakers anymore. It's all done by sophisticated electronics these days. But this is how it used to be done. Now the way it works, when the engine's running, this bit here spins around. This is actually a points cam. And as it spins around, it makes the points open and close like that. And every time the points open, it fires the spark plug. Now what I propose to do is check just how far those points are opening.
Okay.
And in order to do that, we need some means of turning the engine over. Now again, on a more sophisticated bike, there'd be various places you could put a spanner to do it. But the easiest way to do it on a British classic, no it's a Japanese then, is spark plug out, put the bike into top gear. So if I turn the back wheel and operate the gear lever like that, I should be able to get the bike into top gear. What I can do now is use a back wheel to turn the engine over. So if I turn the back wheel and you watch that, you should see that cam going around. And what I'm looking for, there's a line there on the points cam.
Yep.
That line indicates the highest point of lift. So I'm going to line that up to the heel on the points, and that'll give us the widest gap, and that's where we measure it.
Okay.
That making sense?
It is.
Great stuff. So if I turn this wheel over now, you can see it's going the other way. It's wobbling about a bit. But we're nearly there, and there's a line.
That's it. Yeah.
In line with the heel. And that's always a position you need to have the engine in to check the points gap. To check the gap, you'll need something like this. This is a set of feeler gauges. Have you used these before?
I have, yes.
Great, so you know what they are. Basically, each blade on there is a different thickness, and there's a number stamped on the gauge to tell you how thick it is. That's 15 thou. You can buy these in metric sizes as well. Don't be confused. If you work in a British bike, I always use imperial gauges. Do you want to just try that gauge in that gap and see how it feels? And if the gap's right, it should just slide in and drag clear.
Yeah, there's a lot of space there.
Not too big?
Yeah, far too big.
Can I just check that? I think you're right, it actually looks too big from here. Yeah, could drive a bus through that one. Right. It was quite important to me to show you in the points gap and how to adjust them, because if the points gap isn't correct, the ignition timing also isn't right. And I wanted to make sure this bike had a clean bill of health. So next I had to show him how to adjust them. Now, we're starting to work with tiny screws inside a tiny housing here, but the one we need to change is that one. That screw actually locks the points against the back plate. So if I slack that screw off, and now I'm going to use this little screwdriver to move the points housing, and if I've got this right, let's pull it out of the way. What I should be able to do now is move the points gap. Did you see that change?
Yeah.
Right. Now the points have been adjusted, the ignition timing should be spot on, but it's still quite important to make sure that the spark plug is of the correct grade and correctly adjusted.
So Rod, we've managed to get the bike running. Is there anything else I could do to keep it running reliably?
There's lots of things that you can do, Ian. You can upgrade your bike with various bits of modern technology if you want to do it, without necessarily spoiling the characteristics of the bike. One thing I have got here that might interest you is an electronic ignition kit. This gadget actually replaces the points that we've just been looking at on the bike. You've got a device here which comprises of two little electromagnets and a backing plate, and that goes in instead of the contact breakers, and once it's in and set, it can be left in there forever, and it never ever needs adjusting, so it gives you more reliable ignition and something that you don't need to service.
I've seen these before. There's a lot of people would say that it doesn't really fit on a classic bike though.
I think to some degree that's up to you. Once something like this is fitted on the bike, it really isn't visible. so it won't spoil the looks of the bike. It'll make it run a bit more reliably. And while you're correct that it's not quite fully authentic, I think, you know, my own preference would be to go for it, but the choice is yours. And the last job today on Ian's BSA is to make sure that the valve clearances are set correctly, because if they aren't right, the engine will never run properly. Have you ever set valve clearances on an engine like this before?
No, it's another first for me, Rod.
Right, easy enough to do. The first thing I'm going to do is take this cover off here. Again, I'm using a metric spanner for this, but it's the best fit I've got for what should be an imperial size. So please excuse that. Some people still refer to this as doing the tappets, by the way, because we haven't had tappets since side valve engines back in the 30s and 40s. The name kind of stuck. Now what I'm going to do is turn the engine over again until it's in the right place to check the clearances. So I still have the bike in gear, no spark plug, and I'm going to use a back wheel to turn it over. But what I want to do now is gauge when the piston's at the top of its stroke. Now you can buy special tools for this, but we're going to use a crude but effective way today, and that's to use a screwdriver down the spark plug hole. It may look a bit crude, but as long as you're careful, it's quite effective. So if I turn the engine over, I should be able to find exactly when that comes to the very top of its stroke. It's a bit of a delicate juggling act, but we're just about there. Now then, if you want to pick up that feeler gauge, I've got the right size gauge. Just see if that'll fit underneath the rocker arm there. And that's how much clearance we should have on there.
Yeah, that fits, that's fine.
That going okay?
Yeah.
Right, if they're too tight or if you're too slack, you can adjust them. There are adjusters at the other side of the engine. Let's pop that cap back on. And then the absolute last job to finish off, of course, we just bob the spark plug back in, and you're ready to ride this bike back to Scotland tonight. Well, it's been great fun meeting Ian, and I've really enjoyed working on his bike. I don't usually do that much work with British bikes these days. I tend to favour more modern Japanese classic bikes, but I do have a soft spot for these old British bikes because it's what I cut my teeth on. I hope you've enjoyed tonight's show, and do come back next week and see what else is coming into my workshop. And if you'd like me to help you with your bike, check out the Men & Motors website. Bye for now.